8 years ago, someone paid $60,000 to erase a man from existence. Not kill him. Erase him. No name. No record. No one coming to look. It worked. Till a Tuesday morning in December when a CEO stepped out of her limousine, looked down at a homeless man on a Manhattan Totten sidewalk, and went completely still. Because around his neck was his necklace that only one person on Earth could have made, her dead son's necklace. On a man pulled from the Atlantic 8 years ago and left to disappear into the city like he never existed. Someone made a catastrophic mistake. They let him live. The cold came in like it had somewhere to be. Not the polite kind. Not the kind that knocks. The kind that walks straight through the door, but what sits down in your bones and makes itself its home without asking, eh? Dorian West had stopped arguing with it somewhere around year 3. He sat on the same stretch of sidewalk he'd claimed for 2 winters now, corner of Madisonson and 54th, north side, back flat against the stone building behind him. He'd learned that in year 2, press your back against the stone and the wind hits your front instead of wrapping all the way around. Small things. You learned them, or you didn't last. 8 winters. Which was something. He wasn't entirely sure what, but it was something. The morning foot traffic of 5th Avenue moved around him the way water moves around stone, without slowing, without looking. Briefcases and coffee cups and shoes that cost more than a month of everything he needed to survive, all of it flowing past like he was part of the architecture. Not cruel, not hostile, just gone. New York had a particular talent for that, for making certain people invisible. Dorian had become a student of the phenomenon because he was, very often, one of the people being disappeared. You stopped taking it personally around year 4, or you developed a relationship with bitterness that didn't serve you. He'd chosen to stop taking it personally, mostly. In his left hand, a paper cup, half full, still warm. Someone had left it on a bench in Bryant Park, and he'd learned long ago not to ask questions about small mercies. You took them. You said a quiet thank you to the empty air. You let the warmth travel up through your palms, and you didn't think too hard about where it came from. His jacket was navy wool. He'd found it 3 winters ago, folded on top of a trash bag outside a building on 61st, like someone had placed it there on purpose. A tear at the left elbow he'd sewn up himself with a needle and thread from a kit a church volunteer had pressed into his hands one afternoon without making a speech about it. The repair wasn't elegant, but it held. He was good at holding things together that had no right to hold. His right hand rested against his chest. He never did it consciously. Not anymore. But his fingers found the chain the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, without instruction, without deciding. The thin silver links. The pendant beneath the fabric. He didn't take it out, didn't need to. He knew every edge of it by feel alone. The shape of the wing open mid-flight, the flat back, the slight ridge where the stone sat in its setting, red stone, deep red, the color of something that had been underground a long time and was only now catching light. He'd had it since the beginning, since the hospital. He didn't think about the hospital often, because there was nothing useful in it. He'd woken up in a room he didn't recognize, in a body that hurt in ways he couldn't account for, in a city he had no memory of choosing. The nurses had called him John. A doctor with the eyes of someone 3 hours past the end of a long shift had said the words retrograde amnesia in a tone that suggested this was not the first time, would not be the last. There were injuries. He gathered that from the way the staff moved around him. Careful, like something that might not hold. A week in that bed. Then a paper bag with 2 changes of clothes and a bus token and a discharge sheet that someone handed him without looking up from the desk. He'd kept the necklace through all of it, where it had come from that had consumed him in the early years. He'd turned it over in his mind the way you work a knot, looking for the loose end, finding nothing. Eventually you stopped pulling at knots with no loose ends. You accepted them as part of the fabric. The necklace was simply part of him now, the way a scar is part of you, present, unexplained, yours. He pressed his palm flat against the pendant and watched the block do what it always did. The limousine slowed at 8:47 in the morning. Dorian noticed because he noticed everything. Not because a limousine was unusual on this block, he saw several a day, but because this one slowed where limousines didn't slow. Not at a building entrance, not at a light, just slowed, then stopped. His eyes tracked to it without his head moving. He'd learned that. How to watch without advertising it. 8 years of practice made it automatic. The rear door opened. A woman stepped out. Late 50s, charcoal wool coat, leather gloves. Silver hair pulled back in the kind of way that looked simple but cost something. She moved with the precision of someone who'd been making decisions in rooms full of people for a very long time and had stopped performing confidence because it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. She didn't look at the building, didn't check her phone, didn't do any of the things people did when they stepped out of vehicles on this block. She looked at him, not at the sidewalk situation in his general direction, at him, directly, with the focused stillness of someone who has just seen something that doesn't fit the morning they thought they were having. Then her gaze dropped to his chest. Dorian's hand moved before he decided it would, closed around the pendant through the fabric of his jacket. Old instinct. Deep. She crossed the sidewalk. He watched her come. Didn't shift back. Didn't drop his eyes. He'd stopped dropping his eyes around year 3. Dropping them invited certain things, and he'd learned not to invite them. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be deliberate. That necklace. Her voice came out steady, the kind of steady that costs something to maintain. Dorian looked at her face, then at the security man who had stepped out of the passenger seat and was now positioned 6 feet to her left, not quite hovering, but there, then back at her. "I didn't steal it," he said. "I didn't say you did. 1 step closer. I'm asking where it came from." He held her gaze. Around them, the city ran its program, a cab horn, the hydraulic exhale of a bus. Someone's phone going off somewhere behind him, none of it touching this small, still space between them. "I don't know," he said. "I woke up with it." He'd given that answer before 4 times in 8 years when someone noticed the necklace and asked. 4 times the answer produced skepticism or pity or a rapid recalibration of interest followed by departure. This woman went completely still. Not skepticism, not pity, something else entirely. "You woke up with it," she said. "Hospital 8 years ago. He kept his voice level, not performing anything, just saying what was true. No name, nothing else, just this." She looked at the pendant, then at his face. And the expression that moved through hers was layered in a way he couldn't parse quickly. He was good at reading people. 8 years of watching from sidewalks made you precise about it. But whatever this was, it was deeper than a surface read. "What do they call you?" she said. Dorian Wess." A pause. Schiller put the last name on the paperwork. Nurses came up with the first one. I didn't have a reason to disagree. She absorbed that. Then she pulled off one glove, slowly, not because she needed to. Like she needed the action to buy herself a moment to land somewhere. "I want you to come with me," she said. "There's a suite 3 blocks from here. You'll have food." A warm room, a doctor. Not a performance of suspicion. A real question that deserved a real answer. And the woman looked back at him without flinching and gave him one. "Because that necklace belonged to my son," she said. "And he's been gone for 8 years. And you just told me you woke up in a hospital 8 years ago with no name and no history." She held his gaze. "Either you tell me something about what happened, or the necklace does. Either way, I need to know." Dorian was quiet for a moment. He thought about 8 years of mornings exactly like this one. Cold stone and a paper cup, and the city pouring past him like he was furniture. He thought about the 4 times someone had noticed the necklace, and each time the thread went nowhere. He thought about the hospital and the tired doctor and the discharge sheet. He thought about the fact that this woman had stepped out of his limousine and crossed a sidewalk and was looking at him like he was something other than a problem to navigate around. He set the paper cup on the pavement beside him, stood. She didn't step back. He noted that. He was taller than most people anticipated. He could see the small adjustment in her posture. "Not fear, just recalculate blocks," he said. "That's how far I go before I decide." She nodded once. 3 blocks. And they walked. The hotel was the Meridian. Dorian had walked past it 400 times. Dark glass and stone and a doorman who existed in a parallel social universe. He'd filed it years ago as one of the buildings that didn't acknowledge him. Now he was inside it. The warmth hit first, aggressive after the December air, marble floors, low light. The particular silence of a space where noise had been engineered out. The dorm saw him come in beside the woman, and something happened in the man's face. A rapid internal renegotiation. Very fast, very practiced. Dorian had seen it before. The moment a category system encounters information that doesn't fit and has to update. Usually it went badly. This time it went professional, because the woman was already moving and she was not someone whose movement you interrupted with a question. The elevator, 14th floor, the suite. Dorian stood in the center of it and took a slow breath. Large, warm-toned furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows with the city spread out beyond the glass. The kind of room that existed in the parallel city. The city of people whose names were in systems. He didn't say anything about the room. He cataloged exits, read the space, understood it. Old habits, very old apparently. He'd had them since the beginning and had never found the origin of them. The woman crossed to the window, turned. "I'm going to call a doctor. Company for physician. She's good." A pause. "You don't have to agree to anything, but I'm going to ask." "Fine," Dorian said. "Food is coming up. Okay. Is there anything I need to understand what's happening?" he said. "Not with heat. Just directly. That's what I need." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression adjusted. Then let me make the call, she said. And then we'll talk. She hadn't told him her name yet. He hadn't asked. There was a logic to waiting that both of them seemed to understand without discussing it. He walked to the window while she made her call and looked down at the street 14 floors below. He could see the corner of Madison and 54th from here, his corner, 2 winters of that particular stone wall against his back. From up here, it looked like any other corner. Just sidewalk and foot traffic and the city as usual Z's program. He pressed 2 fingers against the glass. Cold came through. He held them there. 8 years on this sidewalk, and he'd never looked down at it from above. He'd never had a reason to be above it. He'd only ever been in it. Part of it. One of the things the morning foot track divided around like water around stone. The woman finished her call and came to stand a few feet away, also looking out. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor Voss. He looked at her. Dorian West, he said, even though she already knew. She almost smiled. Not quite. I know. They stood there for a moment with the city between them and below them and all around them. My son's name was Eli, Eleanor said. She was still looking out. Ellie Voss, he was 29. His car went off a cliff road in Montauk 8 years ago, October, late at night. They searched for 2 weeks. A pause. They never found him. Dorian turned that over, 29. He was 34 now, so 8 years ago he was 26. Found in the water near a cliff road in Montauk 3 days after the accident of a 29-year-old man whose mother recognized the necklace around Dorian's neck. He was running the numbers before he decided to run them. Old habit, very old. The necklace, he said, you designed it. I sketched it at my kitchen table, Eleanor says. Ellie sat across from me and told me the wing shape was too symmetrical. We argued about it for 20 minutes. She paused. He was right. I made it asymmetrical. The jeweler used a garnet Eli himself. When the piece was finished, I asked the jeweler to destroy the mold. She finally looked at him. There is no Osborne. Dorian looked at the pendant through the fabric of his jacket without taking it out. One object, no copy, designed by a woman who was standing 6 feet away from him. Worn by a man who died on a cliff road in Montauk. Found around the neck of a man with no name 8 years ago in a hospital on Long Island. The chain of that was long and he couldn't see all of it yet. He could see sheath of it and the shape of it was not a coincidence. I want to understand what's happened, he said. So do I, said Ella's horse. So do I. Dr. Bernadette Okafor arrived 50 minutes later. She was a compact woman with close-cropped natural hair and the manner of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where the information she carried was the hardest thing present. She shook Dorian's hand first, not as a formality, as a choice. He noticed it. The examination took 1 hour and 15 minutes. She explained every step before she took it. He appreciated that more than he could have put into words. When you'd spent 8 years in spaces where your body was treated as a logistical consideration rather than something that belonged to you, that kind of courtesy landed differently than she probably knew. When she was done, she sat across from him, looked at him directly, didn't look at Eleanor first. Significant retrograde amnesia, she said, consistent with severe blunt force trauma to the head and a near-drowning event. Your body carries evidence of both, no softening. He hadn't asked for any. Healed scarring from prolonged hypothermia. 3 ribs on your left side healed at a slight misalignment. They weren't set correctly at the time of injury. She paused. If you went into cold water in October 8 years ago and survived, Mr. West, that is not a simple thing. I know, he said, and he did. He'd always known it. In the way you know things your mind won't give you clean access to, the way your body knows something your memory has walled off. The period before your hospitalization is largely inaccessible, Dr. Okafor continued. What breaks through is likely sensory rather than narrative. Sound. Temperature. Physical sensation rather than story. Yes, that's right. She gathered her things and stepped into the other room briefly to speak with Eleanor. Dorian stayed by the window. 14 floors up the city ran its continuous program. Traffic, sirens moving north, the same sounds he'd heard from the sidewalk for 8 years, only filtered here, muffled, like sound coming through something thick. He pressed his hand flat against the glass and held it there until Eleanor came back. She sat across from him. No coat now, slightly less CO, still, most of the way there. What do you remember, she said, from before the hospital? Anything. Dorian had turned this question over for 8 years. In the intake interview at the Queen's shelter with a social worker who looked at her notepad more than at him. In the community health clinic in year 3, where a well-meaning therapist with an impossible caseload had asked him to close his eyes and reach for it. In the dark of various rooms, alone. Trying to catch something that dissolved the moment he moved toward it, directly. He looked at Eleanor Voss. She was not looking at a notepad. Not managing her response. Just there. Sound, he said. Most of it is sound. waves, not the kind from a bay or harbor, the kind that come from miles of open water, the real Atlantic. He stopped, voices above me, like I was at the bottom of something and they were at the top. Two of them, arguing. He looked at his hands. Cold. He said it like the word itself had weight. The kind that gets into the part of your brain where thoughts live and shuts them off. One by one, his jaw tightened. And a feeling. Like something was coming, like I needed to move and couldn't make body do it. Eleanor had gone very still. He kept going. There's a woman. Older. Gray at her temples. She's crying. But not the kind of crying that means falling apart. He stopped. She's making a decision at the same time. Both things at once. Like she's decided and the grief of it is happening alongside the deciding. He touched the pendant through his shirt without registering that he'd done it. She puts this in my both hands around mine. She says a name. She says, take this. If something happens tonight, you take it and run. Silence. What name? Eleanor said. Ely, he said, the word sasses between them. Eleanor looked at him, then at the window, then back. My son's name, she said quietly. Yes, a pause. Something moved through her face that her composure could entirely contain. She let it pass through rather than stopping it. Then we need to find the woman from your memory, she said. The one with gray at her temples. Her voice steadied again. I have someone I trust for this kind of work. Former federal agent. Careful and thorough. She looked at him directly, and I need to ask you something else. Go ahead. Would you be willing to give a DNA sample? She held his gaze. I want to tell you the reason before you answer. My husband Thomas died 3 years ago. Before he died, I found documentation of a payment he made 34 years ago to a woman who worked at Voss Capital. I never found the reason for it. She paused. You are 34 years old, Mr. Wes. I am asking because I think there may be more connecting you to Ely than a necklace. Dorian sat with that. 34 years ago. He was 34. He ran it through once. Twice. Yes, he said. I'll give the sample. Eleanor nodded. Then she said, what was he like? The shift in her was subtle. Something softer beneath the structure. Ellie, you were in a memory with him tonight, even if it was blurred at the edges. What did you feel from him? Dorian thought about that. He thought about the voice above him on the cliff road. The urgent one. The one that was trying to convince someone of something in whatever time was left. Determined, he said, past the point where most people stop. A pause. Like he'd already made his decision and was working out the steps. Eleanor looked at the window, and something moved through her face. Something quiet and old and worn in the specific way that things get worn when you've been carrying them a long time. Not broken. Just. Carrying. Yes, she said. That was him. The food arrived. Dorian ate with the particular focus of someone who had learned not to be casual about meals. Not because this one was uncertain, but because the habit was 8 years old, and habits that kept you alive didn't simply switch off because the circumstances changed. Eleanor sat across from him and watched. Not performing, not watching. She watched, and he was aware of it and didn't comment. They had arrived in the space of one afternoon at a kind of directness that skipped several social stages. Probably because neither of them was starting from a position of pretending. After she asked him about the 8 years, not as interrogation, as genuine accounting, he told her. The hospital, the shelter in Queens, the slow understanding that the resources available to people in situation were not built for the specific situation he was in. A man with no name, no history, no anchor point. The years of accumulating small competencies, reading everything he could reach, libraries open early, warm, no questions asked about how long you stayed. The corners and the doorways and the slow process of mapping a city from its sidewalks. He told her without asking for anything in return, without framing it to produce a particular response. He just told her, and she listened the way that meant she was actually inside it. When he finished, she said, You've been preparing. Yes? For what? For when it made sense, he said. The necklace. I always knew it would make sense eventually. I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew the day would come when someone would recognize it. And when that happened, I didn't want to be the person who couldn't follow what came next. Eleanor looked at him, and that thing moved through her expression again. The layered thing. The one with a name she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Ellie was like that, she said quietly. He read everything, prepared for contingencies no one asked him to plan for. A small pause. It drove his father to distraction. Dorian said nothing. He let that sit without addressing it. Sometimes things needed to sit. He'd learned that in 8 years of living very close to grief he couldn't name. That night, Dorian didn't sleep. This was not unusual. He lay on the suite's bed, the most comfortable surface he'd been horizontal on in 8 years, and stared at the ceiling and let the warm room hold him and turn the conversation over. Eli, 29, a cliff road in Montauk, October. The same month, the same coast. The same cold that his body remembered in ways his mind still wouldn't fully allow. He let his breathing slow. The fragments behind the wall in his mind dissolved if you went at them directly. He'd learned that in year 2, like things that existed only in peripheral vision. You couldn't look straight at them. You had to let them find you. He let the warmth of the room settle, let the muffled city come through the glass, closed his eyes, and waited. The waves came first, not the city's sounds, the actual Atlantic. Enormous, close, underneath everything. Miles of open water that had made its decision about the night and was not reconsidered. He didn't move. Voices as above. 2 of them. The younger one with urgency in it, the kind that comes when you're trying to convince someone of something and time is running out. The words blurred at the edges, but the tone clear, the feeling of it clear. Then the cold. Total. The kind that stopped being a temperature and became a decision being made for him by physics. His body and the memory choosing which to keep warm, which to release. And then her hands, smaller than his, pressing around his own from both sides, something placed in his palm, her fingers closing his fingers around it, her breath close to his ear, warm against all that cold. And the words not comfort but instruction, clear and deliberate. The words of someone who has made a decision and is carrying it through cleanly. Eli gave me this to keep you safe. He said if anything happens tonight, you take it and you find a woman named Eleanor. He said she'll know you when she sees this. You take it and you run. He sat up. The sweat came back around him. Warm. Still. The clock read 2:09 in the morning. He sat on the edge of the bed. She'll know you when she sees this. He looked at the pendant in the dark. The faint city light through the curtains catching at the edge of the silver chain. Eli Voss had put this necklace on him, or given it to the woman with gray at her temples with instructions. He'd known in advance that things might go wrong on that cliff road in October. He'd prepared for it. Had thought ahead, had put the one object that could connect Darian back to Eleanor around Dorian's neck with a set of instructions and an act of faith so large Dorian couldn't look directly at it. He stood. Put on the robe. Put his feet in the slippers. Stood in the center of the room feeling slightly absurd, which was fine. Walked to the door, down the hallway. 3 rooms, knocked, a pause, then Eleanor's voice, alert in a way that said she hadn't been sleeping either. Yes, it's Dorian West, low, even. I need to tell you something. Another pause, movement, then the door. Eleanor in her own robe, silver hair loose, 2:00 in the morning and no performance required. She looked at his face and didn't ask if it could wait. The woman in my memory, he said. She gave me specific instructions. She said to find Eleanor. She said you'd know me when you saw the necklace. Kiss. She said Eli gave it to her to give to me. She said he told her to find you if things went wrong. Eleanor stood in the doorway looking at him. A moment passed that had weight to it. Come in, she said. They sat at the small table by the window. No recording, no formality. Hotel robes and 2 in the morning and 8 years of something sitting in the room between them, taking up space. Tell me everything, Eleanor said, exactly as it came. So he did. She listened the way she'd listened all evening, fully inside it, not managing. When he finished, there was a silence with texture to it. The woman with gray at her temples, Eleanor said, cryings and deciding at the same time. Yes, I need to find her. Eleanor looked at the dark window. My investigator, Ray Tatum. I'll call him first thing. He's the one I mentioned, former federal agent. He worked a case for me 7 years ago involving this same woman's name. He hit a wall then because he was looking for a living woman with documentation. Now we know what to look for. Dorian looked at her. He found the name before, in Eli's files, 18 months after the accident. She held his gaze. A payment your father made. I gave Ray the name then, and he found nothing. I didn't know then to ask him to look for a John Doe in a Montauk hospital at the same time. She paused. Now I do. Dorian sat with that chain of things. The length of it, 8 years long, made of small missed connections and one piece of silver that never ended up at the bottom of the Atlantic. We find the woman, he said. Says, yes, and we find out what happened on that rat road. Yes, and we find out what Eli knew, he said, and who knew that he knew it. Eleanor looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, recognition, the specific look of someone encountering something they'd expected to find but hadn't been certain would be there when they looked. Yes, yes, she said, all of it. Dorian nodded. He stood. Get some sleep, he said. She almost smiled. The shape of it was there for a moment, at the corners, before it settled back. You too, she said. He walked back down the hallway, lay on the bed, hand resting over the pendant in the dark, the room warm around him. He didn't sleep for a long time, but the thing keeping him awake had changed. Not the cold, not the formless weight of a life with no edges to grip, something with direction, something that had a shape now, a question that had finally found what it had been looking for. Eli Voss had been 29 and running out of time on a cliff in October, and he had still, in the middle of all of that, thought ahead. Had put the one identifiable object he had around the neck of the one person who needed it most. Had trusted that if Dorian made it through, the necklace would do the rest. He'd been right. Dorian lay in the dark and held the pendant and thought about a 29-year-old man building a bridge for someone he barely knew. And the bridge had held. 8 years underwater, 8 years of no name and no history and no reason to keep holding on to a piece of silver. But he'd held on, because some part of him, the part that outlasted the memory, the part that lived below everything that could be taken away, had known not what, not how, just that it mattered. And that one day, on a cold Tuesday morning on Madison Avenue, the city's long indifference was going to break, and someone was going to step out of a car and look. Dorian closed his eyes. Tomorrow was already different from every day that had come before it. Because it already was. Because tonight he had a name for the thing he'd been carrying. And that changed everything. Ray Tatum arrived the next morning at 9 sharp. He knocked twice. Waited. Didn't knock a third time. Dorian noticed that. The patience of someone who understood that some doors took longer to open than others and didn't make it personal. Eleanor let him in. Ray was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from discipline. He wore a dark coat, carried a leather folder, shook Dorian's hand without making a production of it, and sat down at the suite's dining table like he'd been invited to a meeting, which he had. He looked at Dorian directly, not the recalibration Dorian was used to, not the quick internal sorting. Just looked. The way you look at someone you're planning to take seriously. Eleanor told me about the necklace, Ray said, and about what you remembered last night. He set the folder on the table. I want to find the woman from your memory, and I want to find out what actually happened at Hargrove General 8 years ago. 2 separate things. I'm going to pull both. Dorian said, what do you need? Feed me. Everything you remember. Whatever order it comes in. Don't organize it for me. Just say it. So Dorian said it's all of it. The waves, the 2 voices above him on the road, the cold that shut thought down one piece at a time, the woman with gray at her temples, the hands, the words. He said it the way it actually lived in him, not as a clean story, but as fragments with rough edges that didn't connect neatly, incomplete things, images without frames, sounds without context. Ray listened and wrote nothing down. When Dorian finished, Ray nodded once. 7 years ago, Ray said, looking at Eleanor, I ran the name Wes against every database I had access to and hit nothing, because I was looking for a living woman with a documented address. He paused. Now I know to look for a John Doe in a Montauk hospital and a woman who doesn't want to be found. Those are different searches. He stood. Give me 3 days. Eleanor said, you have 3. Ray picked up his folder and left without another word. Dorian sat at the table after the door closed and looked at the space Ray had vacated. He always liked that, Dorian said. Always, Eleanor said. Good, said Dorian. The DNA kit arrived at our nurse. Dr. Okafor administered it herself. A cheek swab, 30 seconds. She sealed it with the efficiency of someone who has done this before in situations that were also complicated and didn't need to say so. After she left, Dorian asked Eleanor 3 questions about the process, how the cross-referencing worked, how long results took, what the margin of error looked like in a case like this. Eleanor answered all 3 without talking around him. When she finished, she looked at him with that layered expression he was starting to be able to read better. Not all of it, but more of it than yesterday. You've been educating yourself, she said. Libraries are free, Dorian said, and they open early, earlier than most places that are warm. What did you read? He thought about it. Everything I could reach, he said. History, biology, law, some medicine, corporate structure, whatever the branch Bryant Park had on the shelves on a given day. He paused. I didn't know what I was preparing for. I just knew I needed to be ready. For what? For when the necklace made sense, he said. I always knew the day would come. I didn't know what shape it would take. But when it came, I didn't want to be the person who couldn't follow what came next. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression again. The things she was still working up to naming. Allie read everything, she said quietly. He prepared for contingencies no one asked him to prepare for. Drove his father to distraction. She stopped. Then, more carefully, drove me to distraction too, until I understood that it was how he showed he cared about something. He cared about a thing by preparing for every version of it going wrong. She looked out the window. He cared very much about whatever he found when he found you, she said. Dorian said nothing. He lets that sit the way some things needed to sit, without being addressed, without being resolved before it was ready. The waiting had its own texture. 3 days of it. Dorian moved through them with the patience of someone who had spent 8 years learning it was out to losing focus. He read, He walked the suite. He ate the meals that appeared without being requested. He thought about the cliff road at Montauk, about the two voices above him in the dark, about what a 29-year-old man would be doing on that road at night in October, and what he would be arguing about, and with whom. Eleanor came to the suite in the evening. She didn't make small talk, which Dorian appreciated. He had never been good at it and had spent 8 years not pretending otherwise. She asked him things. He answered. She told him things. He listened. She told him about Eli, not the official version, the actual one. Eli Voss had been the kind of person who made situations inconvenient by caring too much about them. He'd pushed against the Voss Capital Board twice in his 20s, once over an investment he found ethically indefensible, once over a personnel's decision that he believed was retaliatory. He was overruled both times. He continued pushing anyway. Being overruled was not, in Eli's understanding of things, the same as being wrong. He had been preparing something in the months before his death. Eleanor had found half-finished documents on his laptop 18 months after the accident. Research notes, names she didn't recognize, a draft proposal incomplete, outlining changes to Voss Capital's inheritance and equity structure, and, once briefly, in a list of names that ran to 40 entries, the name Wes. She said that quietly, like she'd been holding it at a specific distance and had finally set it down. Dorian looked at her. You knew my name was in his files. I found it 18 months after he died. I gave it to Ray. He ran it and found nothing. She held his gaze. 7 years ago, I didn't know to look for a man with no name in a shelter in Queens. I didn't know the connection. I just had a name in a document and a dead end. Dorian sat with that, 18 months after, which meant 6.5 years ago she'd found his name in a dead man's file and hadn't known what to do with it, and the search had gone nowhere. And then 2 days ago, a limousine had stopped on Madison Avenue. He thought about the length of that chain, the years of it, the number of moments that could have broken it. What else was in the document, he said. That's what Ray is going to find out, Eleanor said. Now that we know what we're actually looking for. Ray came back on the morning of the 3rd day. He set his folder on the dining table and sat down without preamble and looked at both of them the way he always looked at things, without hurrying toward the conclusion. Harkover General, he said. October, 8 years ago, 3 days after Eli Voss's accident. He opened the folders. Inside, a photocopy of a hospital intake record. Patient listed as John Doe, black male, approximate age mid-20s, recovered from the water near the base of the cliff road, Montauk. Severe head trauma, hypothermia, near drowning. The admission notes indicated the 911 call had been made by an anonymous caller who did not provide a name or wait for the ambulance. The record was thin, not the thinness of a busy emergency ward running on short staff, the thinness of something that had been gone through afterward. Notes that should have existed were absent. Follow-up documentation standard protocol required was missing. Dorian read it. Read it again. He kept his hands flat on the table. That's me, he said. Yes, Ray said. Keep going. Ray turned to the next section. I located a nurse who worked the emergency ward that night. Retired now, living in Columbus, Ohio. She agreed to speak with me because of what I told her, and because she has a son she raised alone and said that made a difference to her. Ray paused. Her name is Donna Reyes. She remembered the John Doe clearly. She said it was medically unusual, a man that badly injured survived the first 48 hours. The staff expected him not to make it through the first night. A pause, and then she told me about the visitor. Dorian went still. 3 days after you were admitted, Ray said, a man came to the ward, well-dressed, polite in the way of someone managing a conversation toward a specific outcome. He asked about the John Doe specifically, whether the patient had said anything, whether he'd been identified, whether family had been contacted. Ray reached into the folder, pulled out a photograph, security camera footage from the hospital parking lot. Grainy, poor light. Timestamp reading 1:47 a.m. He slid it across the table. He left an envelope with the charge nurse, Ray continued. Donna didn't see the contents, but she saw the charge nurse's behavior change in the days that followed. Within a week, you were discharged to a shelter in Queens. No rehabilitation, no follow-up care arranged, no further record in the system. Your file was closed with a single word. Resolved, Dorian said. Ray looked at him. Resolved, Ray confirmed. Dorian picked up the photograph. The man in the image was moving from his car toward the hospital entrance. Tall, mid-40s then, which put him in his 50s now, dark coat. The unhurried stride of someone who didn't expect to be stopped. Eleanor was looking at the photographs too. Her face did something trolled and complicated. Conrad Hale, she said. She said it flatly. The way you say the name of something you've been looking at out of the corner of your eye for a long time and are now finally looking at directly. 14 years on the Voss Capital Board, Ray said. Casamas's cousin on his father's side. He has been building shareholder support for a vote to remove Eleanor CECC. He's been doing it for 2 years. The vote is scheduled for Monday morning. Dorfran set the photograph down, face up, left it there. He looked at it. Conrad Hale, a man he had never met. A man who had driven to a hospital at 1:47 in the morning 3 days after a Cliff Road accident and left an envelope with a night nurse and walked back to his car and driven home. And Dorian had woken up in a shelter in Queens with a paper bag and a bus token and a word stamped on a file. He said he knew I was there. Yes, Ray said, and he decided what to do about it. Yes, he decided that was enough. Dorian said it without heat, which was somehow more precise than heat, the temperature of a fact being understood fully for the first time. He thought about the word resolved. One word for one man's life, not destroyed, not just managed, filed, closed. He thought about 8 winters pressing his back against stone on Madison Avenue. There's more, Ray said. Dorian looked at him. I went back into Eli's files. Eleanor gave me access to what she'd preserved. I cross-referenced with internal communications from Voss Capital, covering the period 3 months before Eli's accident. Ray turned to the next section of the folder. 3 weeks before he died, Eli met with a woman named Nadia Wess. The name landed in the room. Dorian heard it and felt something move through his chest that he could not immediately name. Not recognition, something older than recognition. Something that lived in a part of him that had no access to language. A frequency he hadn't known he could receive. She was a former employee of Voss Capital, Ray continued. Accounting department, 11th floor. She left the company 34 years ago, abruptly, without a documented reason. He paused. Ella found her. I don't yet know how long it took him, but he found her and he met with her 3 weeks before he died. After that meeting, Eli drafted a document proposing amendments to the Voss Capital equity and inheritance structure. He looked at Eleanor. Conrad had access to internal communications from that period. He would have known Eli was working on something. He would have known the general direction of it, even if he didn't have the full document. Dorian looked at the table. He walked the timeline. Eli finds Nadia Fess. 3 weeks pass. Eli is dead on a cliff road in Montauk. 3 days after that, Conrad Hale is in a hospital parking lot at 1:47 in the morning, making sure the man in the John Doe intake record stays a John Doe. The accident, Dorian said. Ray met his eyes. No direct evidence, Ray said carefully. The investigation at the time found no mechanical fault with the vehicle, no witnesses on record. A single-car accident on a cliff road at night. He paused. What I can tell you is that the timeline is what it is, and that Conrad knew what Eli was preparing, and that his behavior 3 days after the accidents was not the behavior of someone with no stake in what had happened. Dorian said nothing. He sat with it. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder and more useful than rage. The specific temperature of a thing disassembled clearly for the first time, every piece in its place, every connection visible. A 29-year-old man had trying to do something right, and something had happened on a cliff road. And 3 days later, the man connected to that something right had been quietly stamped, resolved by a person who had calculated that his continued existence was an inconvenience that could be managed away. He thought about what that calculation required, what it required you to believe about another person's in order to make it, that they were a variable, a line item, that the city's indifference was a reliable enough instrument that you didn't even need to do anything drastic. You just needed to make sure the system didn't catch them. And the system hadn't. For 8 years, the system had not caught him, because Conrad Hale had been right about one thing. A man with no name and no history and no documentation was a man no one would come looking for. He'd been right about that. He'd been wrong about it being permanent. Where is Nadia Wess now? Dorian said. Ray looked at him. That's the next thread, he said. I have a direction. 2 more days. Eleanor waited until Ray left. Then she sat across from Dorian and placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. He looked at it. DNA results, she said. They arrived an hour before Ray got here. He looked at the envelope, then at her. You waited. I wanted Ray's information to land without this in the room, she said. Once it's open, everything else gets read through it. I needed you to hear what Ray found first. He understood that. The results would change the atmosphere of every fact that followed them. Open it, he said. She picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, set an attack on the table. Before I do, she said, I want to tell you something. She looked at the envelope, not at him. Thomas was a man I trusted for 31 years. We built something together I'm proud of. He could be difficult. He made choices I didn't always agree with. He sometimes chose the company over people in ways that cost things. She paused. But I did not think he was a man who kept rooms for me. Another pause. I may have been wrong about that. Then she opened the envelope. Read it. He watched her face. She was controlled. She had built composure into herself at a structural level over 30 years of operating in rooms where showing your reaction first was a tactical loss. But something moved through her expression that the structure couldn't entirely contain. Something that had been held at a certain angle for a very long time that was now quietly shifting. She set the paper down, looked at Dorian. "Thomas Voss was your biological father," she said. The analysis cross-referenced against the family genetic profile held by our legal team. The result is not ambiguous. The room was very quiet. Dorian held the information. He turned it over, looked at its edges. Thomas Voss, dead 3 years, married to Eleanor for 31 years, built a company, made a payment 34 years ago to a woman who had worked on the 11th floor of his building and then left abruptly and was never mentioned again. Dorian thought about Nadia Wess, the woman with gray at her temples, who had pressed a necklace into his hands in the dark beside the Atlantic and given him instructions in the voice of someone carrying 2 things at once. His mother, that word. He hadn't had access to that word in 8 years. In 8 years, it had been an abstract category, something that applied to other people, something he could observe in others, but couldn't locate in his own life because his own life had no edges to attach it to. His mother had stood in the dark on a cliff in Montauk and put a necklace in his hands and told him to run and find Eleanor. And then she had been, what? Where? What had she done after he went into the water? What had she believed for 8 years about whether he was alive? He realized he was gripping the edge of the table. He released it. "She gave me this," he said. He touched the pendant. "That night. Eli gave it to her with instructions, and she gave it to me." He looked at Eleanor. "She knew who you were. She knew the necklace would mean something to you." "Ellie told her," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but the thing behind it was not steady. "He found her, and he told her about me, about the necklace. He was building a path back in case things went wrong." "Things went wrong," Dorian said. "Yes." "And the path held anyway." Eleanor looked at him. And whatever she was holding, the grief of a marriage with a room she'd never been shown, a son who'd been correcting something alone, 8 years of a truth that had been sitting on a sidewalk on Madison Avenue, all of it was present in her face for a moment, all of it visible. She let it be visible. Then she pulled it back. Not because she was ashamed of it, because she was not done. And grief of that size required a time and a place that was not this table, not with this much still unfinished.
"I need to find Nadia Wess,"
she said. "Sotsai," said Dorian. "Ray found her on the 2nd day. He came back to the suite in the late afternoon and sat down and opened his folder without ceremony. Newark, he said. She's been there 3 years. Before that, she moved 6 times in 5 years. Queens, Brooklyn, 2 addresses in the Bronx, 1 in Jersey City, 6 times in 5 years, Eleanor said. Yes. Dorian leaned forward slightly. "She was running. Or being careful," Ray said. "Those 2 things look similar from the outside." He turned a page. "Approximately 2 weeks after your discharge from Hargrove General, Nadia Wess received a piece of mail at her address in Astoria, Queens." He paused. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. Her home address was written on it, her personal phone number, nothing else, no name, no words. The room went quiet in a specific way. Dorian understood immediately what that meant. He'd lived long enough on the margins of systems to understand how certain messages worked. You didn't need to write a threat. You just needed to demonstrate knowledge. Her address, her number, the things she thought were private and safe. You let her know you knew, and she would understand everything that followed from that without you having to say it. "She moved within a week of receiving it," Ray said. "And again 4 months later. And again. 6 times before she stopped in Newark 3 years ago." "Why did she stop?" Dorian said. Ray looked at him steadily. "I think she got tired, and I think she decided she was done running. Both things." Dorian sat back. He thought about a woman who had stood on a cliff in the dark and made the hardest decision of her life, and then spent 8 years moving from address to address through cities close enough to New York that she never fully left, never went further. Like she was staying within reach of something she couldn't name and couldn't give up, not knowing if he'd survived. 8 years of not knowing. He said, "She thinks I'm dead. I don't believe she knows otherwise." Trey said, "No." Something large was in the room with them now. Something that had been building since the morning Eleanor stepped out of the limousine. The necklace, the hospital record, the photograph of Conrad Hale at 1:47 in the morning, the DNA results, the single sheet of paper mailed to a woman in Astoria. All of it connected. All of it pointing back to the same man. "Conrad," Dorian said. Ray nodded. "The financial records took the most time," Ray said, "but they're there. 2 transfers totaling $60,000. From a private account registered to a shell company incorporated in Delaware." He turned to the final section of the folder. "Our forensic accountant traced the holding structure. It leads to Conrad Hale. $60,000. Dorian let that number sit. $60,000 to stamp a word on a file, to hand a man a paper bag and a bus token and close out his record, to make sure the city's did the rest of the work. He looked at the photograph of Conrad Hale, still face up on the table. He didn't try to kill me, Dorian said. No direct evidence of that, Ray said. He just made sure I stayed gone. Yes, he decided that was his permanent solutions. He said it without heat, the cold kind of clarity that was more useful than anger. Ray said something. Eleanor said nothing. They both understood what he was doing, laying it out clean, looking at all of it at once before he decided what to do with it. A man in a suit who had walked into a hospital at 1:47 in the morning and made a calculation, who had looked at a John Doe, a black man with no name, no documentation, no family to inquire, decided that the cleanest solution was to let the city indifference absorb him, who had understood that New York was very good at not finding certain people once they stopped being easy to find, who had been right about that, actually. For 8 years, he had been right. Dorian sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. How long until the board vote? He said. Monday morning, Eleanor said. 4 days. Dorian nodded. He looked at the pendant through his jacket, then at the photograph, then at Eleanor. Tell me about the boardroom, he said. How the meeting runs, who sits where, how a motion like Conrad's moves through the room. Eleanor looked at him. Something in her posture adjusted slightly. Not surprise. More like a door opening that she'd been waiting to see opened. Why, she said, even though she knew. Because I want to understand what I'm walking into, Dorian said. Before I walk into it. A pause. You're sure, she said. I've been sure since I looked at that photograph, which was true. The moment he'd seen Conrad Hale's face on that grainy parking lot footage, something in him had settled into a stillness that was not peace and not calm, but was more useful than either. The stillness of a man who has spent 8 years waiting for something to point at and has finally found the thing. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and then she told him about the boardroom. Adrian Reeves arrived that evening with a document box. She was a tall woman with natural hair pulled back and the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where being the most prepared person present was the only advantage that reliably held. She set the box on the dining table and looked at Dorian and Eleanor in turn without ranking the look. She walked them through the documentation, the hospital record, the parking lot footage, Donna Prius' signed statement, the DNA certification, the financial records and the shell company and the forensic trail that led to Conrad Hale. Dorian listened to all of it, then asked 3 questions. He asked about the legal standard for introducing the hospital record as evidence of intent rather than simple negligence. He asked about the chain of custody on the financial documents and what Conrad's lawyers would look for first. And he asked whether Conrad had a procedural mechanism to delay the vote once a formal fraud allegation was raised in the room. Adrian answered all 3 without pausing. After the 3rd answer, she looked at him over her reading glasses, then looked at Eleanor. The look communicated several things without saying any of them. Conrad is going to come at your identity, Adrian said to Dorian directly. That's his play. You have no documented histories before 8 years ago. No paper trail. He's going to stand up in that room and argue that a man with no verifiable past cannot be used as a credible instrument in a governance challenge. She held his gaze. He's going to try to make you not exist in front of 12 people while you're sitting in the room. Dorian looked at her. He's done that before, he said. Adrian held the look. I know, she said. That's exactly why I'm telling you. After Adrian left, Dorian sat alone at the table for a while. Eleanor had gone to make calls. Ray had sent a message saying he had one more thing to check and would report in the morning. The suite was quiet in the particular way of a space where a lot had happened and was now absorbing it. Dorian read through the documentation Ray had assembled. All of it. Not because he'd missed something. He hadn't missed anything. He read it because he wanted every piece of it sharp and present, not filed away. Right there where he could reach it, he found one thing that sat at an angle to the rest. The 2 voices on the cliff road, in the memory. Eli's was one, urgent, running out of time, trying to convince someone of something. Whose was the other? Conrad had been at the hospital 3 days later. He'd known enough to come, which meant he'd known something that night, which meant he'd been somewhere connected to the events of that night. The official investigation had found no witnesses. That was not the same thing as there having been no witnesses. Dorian noted it, set it next to the other things he needed to ask Ray in the morning. Then he thought about Nada West in Newark. 6 addresses in 5 years. A woman who had stayed close enough to New York that she never fully left, but far enough from any specific place that she could move again quickly if she needed to, keeping herself within reach of something she couldn't name. Staying. in the way that people stay near something even when they don't know why. She thought he was dead. She had stood on that cliff and put a necklace in his hands and told him to run, and then he had gone into the water. And she had gone into her own kind of disappearing. Both of them gone. Neither knowing the other had survived. He thought about what Ray had said. I think she got tired, and I think she decided she was done running. Both things. It was probably both things at once. He sat at the table until past midnight. Then he closed the folder. Went to the window. The city was doing its late-night version of itself. Same frequencies, lower volume. The lights. The taxis that owned these hours. The particular quality of a city that never fully stopped but breathed differently after midnight. He pressed his palm against the glass. Cold came through. He held it there. 8 years ago, he'd been in cold water, in the dark with Eli Voss somewhere above him on a cliff road and his own name somewhere inaccessible and a piece of silver pressed into his hands. Now he was on the 14th floor of a hotel with a folder of evidence and 4 days. He thought about Conrad Hale right now, wherever he was. In his apartment or his office or moving through the evening of a man who had made a decision 8 years ago and watched it work, who had spent 8 years watching it work, who had watched Dorian West dissolve into the city's indifference and never come back, who was 4 days from taking everything Thomas Voss had built away from the woman Thomas Voss had built it with, and who did not know, could not know, that a limousine had stopped on Madison's Avenue, that a woman had stepped out and walked across a sidewalk, that a man's head stood up from the pavement and said 3 blocks and no further until I decide. Conrad Hale had made a calculation. He had been right about almost everything. He had been wrong about permanent. Dorian turned from the window, went to the desk. He picked up the hotel notepad and wrote one question at the top of the page. The second voice on the cliff road. He circled it, set the pen down. Monday morning was 4-day way. He lay down on the bed, hand resting over the pendant in the dark, the room holding its warmth around him. And for the first time in 8 years, he let himself get angry. Not the hot kind. Not the kind that moves without direction. The cold kind. The kind with edges. The kinds that knows exactly what it's for and what to do with itself. He held that and waited for morning. Sunday came in gray and cold. The kind of gray that settled over the city at dawn and didn't shift. Flat and permanent, like a decision already made before anyone woke up to have a say in it. Dorian was up at 5. He hadn't slept much. Not because his mind was racing, because it was doing the opposite. Going very quiet, very focused. The way it went when something that mattered was close. He learned to trust that quiet. He stood at the window in the dark and watched the city come back to itself slowly. The lights, the first taxis, the delivery trucks that owned these early hours before the foot traffic arrived and reclaimed the streets. The particular quality of a city waking up, which was different from a city already awake in ways he'd spent 8 years learning to read. He dressed, sat at the desk. Read through Ray's folder one more time. Not because he'd missed something, he was certain he hadn't. He read it because he wanted everything sharp, present, not filed away in the back somewhere, but right there on the surface where he could reach it without searching. Every fact, every name, every date. The timeline he'd been building in his head since Ray first laid the documents out. Eli finding Nadia 3 weeks before the cliff road. Conrad in the parking lot at 1:47 in the morning, the envelope with the night nurse. The single sheet of paper mailed to Astoria with an address and a phone number and nothing else. The 6 moves in 5 years. The word resolved stamped at the bottom of a hospital file. All of it connected, all of it pointing the same direction. He closed the folder when the city was fully light, set it in his desk. Looked at it for a moment, then looked at the pendant lying on the desk beside it. He'd taken it off for the first time in 8 years the night before, not because it meant less, because it's meant something different now. It had spent 8 years being the only visible proof that his life before the hospital had been real, that someone had placed it there with intention, that he had mattered to someone somewhere in a before he couldn't access. He didn't need it visible anymore. He knew he'd mattered. He had the folder to prove it. Had Eleanor 1 floor up. He had Ray working threads that were still unraveling. He had a name on a DNA document and another name on a DNA document, and between them, the shape of something he was only beginning to be able to look at directly. He picked up the pendant, held it in his palm for a moment, the familiar weight of it, the ridge of the setting, the flat back. Then he put it in the inside pocket of the jacket hanging over the chair. Clothes. Just not outside anymore. Adrienne Reeves arrived at 8. She came in with a document box and 2 associates and the focused energy of someone who had been awake for several hours, already doing the kind of preparation that didn't show on the surface, but was evident in the way she moved through the suite-sized dining area and set things up without wasting emotion. She looked at Dorian and Eleanor in turn. Let me walk you through what we have, she said, what we need, and what Monday is going to look like. She opened the box. The documents were organized with the kind of precision that was itself a form for argument. Tabbed, cross-referenced. Everything in the order it would need to be presented, and in the order a mind under pressure could reach for it without fumbling. Tab 1, Adrian said. Saw Spittle intake record. Hargrove General. 3 days after Eli Voss's accident, patient listed as John Doe, black male, approximate age, mid-20s. This establishes as the documented existence of a survivor connected to the Montauk incident and the timeline overlap with Conrad Hale's actions. She turned to the next section, tab 2. Security footage from the Hargrove General parking lot. Timestamp 1, 47 a.m. Conrad Hale arriving and departing 19 minutes on premises. No documented contact with medical staff. Obtained through formal records request to the hospital security archive. She kept moving. Tab 3, DNA analysis.
Cease independent laboratory full custody.
Cross-reference against Voss family genetic profile. Confirms Dorian West as biological son of Thomas Voss. She looked at Dorian when she said that, not performing sensitivity around it. Just acknowledging that this was a fact with weight and she was not going to treat it like a procedural footnote in a document box. Tab 4, financials records. 2 transfers totaling $60,000. Shell Company Incorporated in Delaware, holding structure traced by our forensic accountant to Conrad Hale personally. Transfer dates correspond to the week of Dorian's discharge from Hargrove General. She closed that tab and moved to the next. Tab 5, signed written state from Donna Reyes. Night shift. Hargrove General. She witnessed Conrad Hale on the ward that night. She witnessed him speaking with the charge nurse and leaving the envelope. She is specific, she is credible, and she is prepared to testify. Adrian set her hands flat on the table. What we have, she said, is enough to initiate a formal fraud investigation. Enough to contaminate Conrad's motion and provide the board with grounds to table the vote indefinitely. She paused. What we do not have is a unanimous room. Conrad has been working 4 of the 12 board members privately for 2 weeks. I know which 4. I've read on where each of them will land when they see this documentation. 3 of the 4 I'm confident about. She paused. Gerald Marsh I'm less certain of. He's been on this board since Thomas's time. He and Conrad were close once. I don't know what Conrad has said to him in the past 2 weeks. Eleanor said, Gerald knew Thomas better than Conrad did. Whatever Conrad has told him, Gerald will read the DNA documentation and he will know what it means. I think so too, Adrian said, but I wanted you to know he's the variable. Dorianson said, what do you need from me tomorrow? Adrian looked at him directly. Your presence in that room, your DNA documentation, your testimony if you're willing to speak. She held his gaze. And I need you to understand something before you walk in. Conrad is going to come at your identity. That's his play. You have no documented history 8 years ago. No paper trail, no photographs in any system. He is going to stand up in that room and argue that a man with no verifiable past cannot be used as a credible instrument in a governance challenge. She didn't look away. He's going to try to make you not exist in front of 12 people while you're sitting a frostable from him. Dorian looked at her. He's done that before, he said. Adrian held a look. I know, she said. That's exactly why I'm telling you. Ray came by at noon. He sat down and didn't open a folder. He'd said what the folder had to say. What he brought now was different. Nadia West, he said. I spoke to her this morning. The room went quiet. Dorian did not move. I told her who I was working for. I told her, we had found her son. Ray said it plainly, not building to it, not cushioning it. She didn't speak for close to a minute. Then she asked me if he was all right. Dorian looked at the table. What did you tell her? I told her he was in a suite at the Meridian Hotel in Midtown and that he was all right. Ray paused, she cried, about a minute. Then she asked when she could see him. Eleanor had moved to the window, her back to the table, not performing composure, actually needing a moment that wasn't being observed. Dorian said, what did you tell her? I told her I'd call her back, Ray said, because I wanted to talk to you first. Dorian looked at his hands. Those hands. The scar across the right palm he'd had since the hospital with no explanation for how it got there. The knuckles that had cracked through too many winters. The left hand with a line across the back from his second year, when something had gone wrong that he'd handled and didn't revisit. His mother had held these hands in the dark on a cliff at Montauk. She'd closed her fingers around his and put a piece of silver into his palm and told him to run, and he had never, not once in 8 years, known if she was alive. He said, can she come Monday? Ray said, I can ask her. Ask her! Ray nodded, stepped away from the table, and made the call in the hallway. Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at Dorian. Are you all right? He thought about that question seriously, the real version of it. Not entirely, he said, but I will be. He paused. That's honest. She nodded. She understood something in that answer that didn't need to be translated. Ray came back. She said yes, he said. She'll be there. Then he said one more thing. When I told her about Monday, she didn't hesitate. She said she'd been waiting 8 years for a room like that. Dorian sat with that. 8 years of moving from address to address. 6 apartments in 5 years. A woman keeping herself small and mobile and close enough to New York that she never fully left. And when Ray called and told her there was a room and a day and a chance, she didn't hesitate. She'd been waiting. So had he. They just hadn't known they were waiting for the same thing. Sunday evening, Adrian came back. She spread everything across the dining table and walked through Monday in sequence. How the meeting would open. How Conrad's motion was structured on the agenda. The order in which the documentation would be introduced. Who would speak at each stage. What Conrad would likely say and in what order he would say it, and where his strongest arguments landed and where they didn't. Dorian listened to all of it. He asked 4 questions. He asked about the legal threshold for the board to suspend a motion mid-meeting based on a fraud allegation. He asked what Conrad's procedural options were once the fraud documentation was formally entered. He asked whether Donna Reyes's written statement carried the same legal weight as live testimony in a bird proceeding of this type. And he asked about Gerald Marsh, specifically, not his voting history, but his relationship to Thomas Voss, and what Thomas would have thought about what Conrad had done. Adrian answered the first 3 from documentation. The 4th one she thought about for a moment. Thomas would have been angry, she said. Not because of the ethics of it, though that too, because Conrad used Thomas's name and Thomas's company to do it. Thomas was vain about the company in the way that men who build things are vain about them. He would not have wanted it used as a vehicle for this. She paused. Gerald knew that about Thomas. That's what I'd remind him of if I had 60 seconds alone with him meeting. Eleanor said, I'll have 60 seconds. Then use them on Marsh. After Adrian left, Dorian sat at the desk and read the governance documents she'd left behind. He made notes on his hotel notepad. He mapped the structure of the meeting. He thought about what Conrad would do in sequence and what the responses to each move needed to be. He thought about what Adrian had said. He's going to try to make you not exist in front of 12 people while you're sitting across the table from him. Dorian sat with that for a long time. He'd spent 8 years not existing, technically, by every measure the world used to count people. No record before 8 years ago. No photograph in any system. No documentation. A man assembled from shelter paperwork and library cards insists the stubborn fact of Stiggs and despite everything arguing he shouldn't be. Conrad had looked at all of that and made a calculation. A man with no name was a man no one would come looking for. He'd been right about that. No one had come looking. Not for 8 years. The system that was supposed to catch people hadn't caught him because the system had been helped along in not catching him by a man in a dark coat with an envelope, until a woman stepped out of a limousine. Because of a necklace. Because of a 29-year-old man who had built a bridge with the most identifiable object he had and trusted it to do the work he couldn't finish himself. Dorian set down the pen. He looked at the inside pocket of his jacket hanging over the chair, the slight weight of the pendant in there, the shape of it just visible through the fabric. He thought about Eli Voss, 29 years old, on a cliff road in October, running out of time, still thinking ahead, still building a contingency for someone else, still believing, past the point where most people stopped believing, that the truth had enough weight to eventually surface. He'd been right about that, too. Dorian picked up the pen, went back to his notes. Monday was 13 hours away. He was not going to walk into that room unprepared. Monday came in the same fray as Sunday. The city didn't mark it as different. Same taxis, same foot traffic, routing around the same obstacles in the same patterns. Same indifferent machinery running its usual program regardless of what was happening 14 floors above it or 42 floors above it or anywhere else. At 7:15, Adrian called. Conrad had issued a statement. 43 minutes before the scheduled meeting, he sent a written communication to all 12 board members. Adrian read it aloud at the dining table. Her voice was precisely controlled. The statement was measured. Professional. The kind of document that takes a long time to write to sound like it required no time at all. It argued that an individual with no verifiable documented history prior to 8 years ago, no legal record, and no provable continuous identity was being introduced into a governance proceeding as a destabilizing instrument. It used the word integrity 4 times. It used the phrase as due process twice. Every sentence was technically defensible. It never said anything directly false. It didn't need to. It just said Dorian didn't exist, again, in writing, distributed to 12 people who were about to sit across a table from him. Dorian read it. Read it again. Set it face down on the table. He got in front of it, Eleanor said. He always does. When something threatens him, he frames it before anyone else can. It's a good move, Dorian said. Adrian said it's designed to make the members who are already uncertain feel like cautions is the responsible position. I know, Dorian said. It would work on me if I were them. He stood, picked up his jacket. Let's go, he said. The Voss Capitol building was 42 floors of dark glass on 6th Avenue. Dorian had walked past it. Of course he had. In 8 years of knowing this city from its sidewalks, he had walked past virtually everything. He'd filed it years ago as one of the buildings that existed in the parallel city. The cities of people whose names were in systems and whose existence the systems confirmed and protected. He went through the front door, the lobby, cold marble, high ceilings. The acoustic silence of a space where sound had been managed out, the security desk. 2 guards who saw Eleanor and did the renegotiation fast. Then saw a door beside her and did it again, differently and faster, because Eleanor was already moving. The elevator, 42 floors. Dorian watched the numbers climb. He thought about the last time he'd been in an elevator, a shelter in the Bronx, broken stairwell, functional but unreliable. You used it when you had to. Now he was going up 42 floors to a room where 12 people were waiting, and one of them had decided 8 years ago that he should not exist and had spent $6,000 in 19 minutes in a hospital hallway making sure of it. He touched the inside pocket of his jacket. The pendant was there. He felt the slight weight of it through the fabric. The elevator opened. The boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the city gray and, what might beyond it, a table of dark wood that seated 14. 12 chairs already occupied when Dorian and Eleanor walked through the door. The room was performing normalcy. Coffee cups, leather portfolios, low conversation that stopped when it needed to stop. It stopped. 12 heads turned. Conrad Hale stood near the far end of the table. Charcoal suit, dark tie. The easy, occupying presence of a man who had spent 2 decades in rooms like this and understood their grammar at a level below conscious thought. He'd been talking to 2 board members. He stopped when the door opened. He looked at Eleanor first, then at Dorian. Something moved through his face. Very small, very fast. Not recognition. Conrad didn't know Dorian's face. Something else. The specific expression whose equation has acquired a variable he didn't account for and who is now rapidly recalculating without showing that he's doing it. Then it was gone. Sealed beside the composed face of a man who had prepared for this morning for a long time. Dorian looked at the room. Not at Conrad. Not yet. He looked at the table and the windows as in the 12 faces in the city beyond the glass. He cataloged it the way he cataloged every space he for first time, reading it, understanding it. He found his chair to Eleanor's left and sat. Eleanor took the head of the table. Adrian, Eats, and 1 associate took seats along the wall. The document box opened between them. Good morning, Eleanor said, the same tone she used every Monday, unhurried, in possession of the room's atmosphere before anyone else could stake a claim to it. I know that there's a function on this morning's agenda. I'd like to address it, but first I need to introduce someone. Conrad's hand moved almost imperceptibly on the table's edge. This is Dorian's Wes, Eleanor said. He is the biological son of Thomas Voss, confirmed by DNA analysis cross-referenced against the Voss family genetic profile held by our legal team. She let that settle over the room, let it land on each of the 12 faces in turn. He is by blood and by law a Voss heir. And he has been living on the streets of this city for 8 years because someone in this company made sure he stayed there. The room, the kind of quiet that wasn't silence. It was the quiet of 12 people processing information that was restructuring the morning they'd walked into. Quiet of foundations shifting. Conrad spoke first. His voice was measured. He spread his hands slightly across the table in a gesture of patient reasonableness. Eleanor. He used her first name. Old habit. A small thing that wasn't small. I understand the pressure you've been under. But introducing a man with no verifiable documented history into a governance proceeding and making claims of this magnitude without the DNA certification is in front of you, Adrian said from the wall. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Tab 3 of the document package. Analysis is conducted by an independent laboratory with full chain of custody. Tab 7 contains security camera footage from the Hargrove Regional parking lot showing Conrad Hale on premises at 1:47 a.m., 3 days after Eli Voss's accident. Tab 9 contains a signed written statement from Donna Reyes, the night shift nurse on duty, who witnessed Conrad Hale leaving an envelope with the charge nurse that evening. Tab 11 contains financial records showing 2 transfers totaling $60,000 from a shell company our forensic accountant has traced directly and personally to Conrad Hale. Gerald Marsh, who had been with Voss Capital since Thomas built it, was already reaching for the document package. Reading glasses out. Turning to tab 3, two other board members exchanged a look across the table. Conrad's composure held. It was genuinely remarkable. The composure of a man who had planned extensively for the possibility of exposure, but had planned for a harder version of it than this. He looked at the room and then back at Eleanor with the expression of someone deciding which argument to deploy first. "This is a fabrication," he said. His voice stayed controlled, but something beneath it had compressed. "Eleanor has been watching her position erode for 2 years, and this is an attempt to sit down Conrad." Gerald Marsh. Quiet, glasses halfway down his nose, not looking up from depth 3. The finality of it was in the tone of a man who had known Tas for 4 years and had just read something that told him what kind of man Conrad Hale was and had made a decision about that in the time it took to read 2 pages. Conrad did not sit immediately. He stood for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and in that moment something changed in his face. Not guilt, precisely. Something more structural. The expression of a man who's built an architecture over many years and is standing in as it comes apart and has not yet found the exit. He sat, the room exhaled. Dorian had not spoken since they walked in. He sat with his hands folded on the table and watched Conrad with the focused stillness of a man who had been waiting 8 years for this specific moment, is not going to rush it. He let the room settle fully. Then he spoke. "I don't remember the night it happened." His voice was low and even, addressed to the room rather than to Conrad specifically. "I woke up in a hospital not knowing my name. I spent 8 years on the street. I'm not saying that for sympathy." He looked at the 12 faces one at a time, giving each of them a moment. "I'm saying it because the person who arranged those 8 years believed it was a permanent solution. He decided that a man with no name and no documentation and no one coming to look for him was a problem that would solve itself. He decided the city would do the rest of the work for him." He paused. He was right about most of it. He looked at Conrad. He was wrong about permanent. Conrad said nothing. The door opened. Not dramatically, not announced. It opened before door windows open when someone at her side simply reaches for the handle and walks through. Nadia West came into the room. She was 61 years old, and she walked in with the bearing of a woman who had made a decision somewhere over the distance between Newark and this building and had not reconsidered it since. She wore a dark coat, simple. She'd done her hair. She carried nothing. She didn't look at Dorian first. She looked at Conrad Hale. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has carried the knowledge of a person for a very long time without being permitted to say it, who has moved 6 times in 5 years, who has spent 8 years not knowing if her son was alive, who has sat with all of that in rooms across 3 states and has arrived, finally, in a room where she can say what she knows to the people who need to hear it. Conrad looked at her, and the composure broke. Not loudly, not in a way that announced itself to everyone in the room simultaneously, but Dorian saw it. He'd been watching Conrad's face with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years watching faces from the margins and knew exactly what it looked like when something real moved through a person against their will. Fear, real and specific, in knowing exactly what it had to be afraid of. Nadia walked to the table. She sat in the empty chair that Ray had positioned before the meeting. She set both hands flat on the surface. "My name is Nadia West," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. The voice of someone who has been quiet for a long time and has decided that the quiet is finished. "I am the biological mother of Dorian West. I am the person who placed that necklace around his neck on the night of October 14th, 8 years ago, at the base of the cliff road in Montauk. I'm the person Eli Voss contacted 3 weeks before his death, and I'm the only living witness to what occurred at that location on that night." She paused. "Let that land. I flagged down a car on the road above and gave them the location to call emergency services. I did not give my name because there was a man on that road who had just watched what happened and who I believed would use my name against my son if I provided it." She looked at Conrad. Her gaze didn't waver. "I received a letter 14 days later. My home address, my personal phone number, a single sheet of paper with nothing else on it. I understood what it meant. I moved the following week." She looked at the room. I have been waiting 8 years for a room this one," she said. "I would like to board what I witnessed that night." The room was very still. Gerald Marsh closed the document package in front of him, took off his reading glasses, set them on the table. He looked at Conrad Hale for a long moment. Conrad did not return the look. Adrian addressed the board. The motion for leadership change was not simply moot. It was contaminated by the documented and witnessed fraud of the man who had introduced it. The board had both the right and the legal obligation to table the vote pending a full investigation by appropriate authorities. Beyond that, the documented evidence of criminal conduct, the financial transfers, the hospital visit, the intimidation of a witness, provided clear grounds to move immediately for Conrad's removal. Gerald Marsh seconded the motion for removal before Adrian had finished the sentence. The vote took 7 minutes, 9 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 against. 9 was enough. The 2 officers from the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit entered through the side door. Conrad Hale stood without being asked. He straightened his jacket. He looked at no one. Not Eleanor. Not Dorian. Not Nadia. Not Gerald Marsh, who was watching him with the expression of a man who has revised his understandings of someone he thought he knew and is still working through what that revision costs him. Conrad looked at the middle distance with the sealed expression of a man who has run out of moves and has nothing left available to him except the performance of not showing that he knows it. He walked out. The rooms exhaled one final time. It was a different exhale than the ones before it. The others had been relief. This one was something more settled. The particular release of a thing that has been held in suspension for a long time finally being allowed to land. The board members dispersed in ones and twos, quiet, with the subdued energy of people who had arrived expecting one kind of morning and were leaving inside a different one that they were still assembling around themselves. Gerald Marsh stopped beside Dorian on his way to the door. He was a broad man in his 70s with the kind of face that had been weathered by a lot of time spent paying attention to things. He looked at Dorian for a moment, fitting something together. "Your father was a complicated man," Gerald said. "Not always a good one, but he built something worth protecting." He paused. "I'm glad you're here." He didn't wait for a response. He moved on. Dorian watched him go. Then he turned, and Nadia West was 3 feet away. The room was emptying around them. Eleanor and Adrian near the far wall in a quiet conversation. Ray by the door, the officers gone, the document box being repacked by Adrian's associate. Just the 2 of them. In a boardroom on the 42nd floor with the gray city pressing in on 2 sides. Dorian looked at his mother. She looked like the woman from the memory. Of course she did. The gray at her temples was wider now. The lines in her face carried 8 years that hadn't been there in the fragment. But the eyes were the same. The thing in them that he'd felt even in the fragment, even when he couldn't see clearly. The thing that cried and decided at the same time. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she covered the distance between them and put her arms around him and held on in the way of a woman who did not know for 8 years if this moment was ever going to happen and was not going to waste a single second of it being anything other than exactly what it was. Dorian stood for half a second. Then he held on too. The city ran outside the glass. The room finished emptying. And 8 years of not knowing pressed itself out through 2 people holding each other in a boardroom that had absolutely no language for something that's human happening inside it. Eleanor arranged a room. She did it without being asked, without making a production of it. A small conference room at the end of the hall, away from the foot traffic of the aftermath, away from the phones and the legal conversations and the practical machinery of consequence. She walked down with them and opened the door and didn't come in. She just opened it. And Nadia looked at her over Dorian's shoulder. And Eleanor looked back, and something passed between the 2 women that had no clean category. It was the acknowledgement of 2 people connected by a grief that belonged to both of them in different ways, for different reasons, who were standing in the sensate's place for the first time and understanding that. Eleanor nodded once, Nadia nodded once, and Eleanor pulled the door closed. They sat in that room for 2 hours. What was said in there belonged to them. What Dorian could say was this. Nadia had known about him since before he was born. She had spent 34 years keeping a silence that was never hers to keep because a powerful man had made it the condition of her safety and the safety of her son. She had raised Dorian alone and had watched him grow up and leave and had spent years afterward wondering about the choices she'd made and whether other choices had existed. Eli Voss had found her through records that should not have been accessible and a determination that had no natural stopping point. He had shown up at her door on a Tuesday afternoon with his mother's photograph and a necklace and a plan that was simultaneously the most careful and most frightening thing anyone had ever laid in front of her. He had explained what was happening, what Conrad was positioning to do. He had given her the necklace and told her that if things went wrong on the cliff road that night, she needed to find Dorian and put it on him and tell him Eleanor would know. He had believed that. He had been 29 years old and running out of time on a cliff road in October, and he had still, in the middle of all of it, believed that. He'd been right. Nadia had been there that night. She'd driven to Montauk because Eli had asked her to wait at the base of the cliff in case things went wrong. Things had gone wrong. She'd gotten Dorian to the rocks. She'd flagged down a car on the road above and given the location without her name. She'd watched the ambulance come from a distance, and then she'd left because Conrad had been on that road and she had known what staying would cost. She'd spent 8 years not knowing. So had the Dorian, both of them disappearing in different directions on the same night. Both of them surviving, neither knowing about the other. Until limousine stopped on Madison Avenue. When they came out of the conference room 2 hours later, Eleanor was in the hallway, waiting. She had a phone in her hand that she wasn't looking at. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at Dorian first, then at Nadia. She said, "Adrian is ready when you are. No rush." That evening, the four of them sat in Eleanor's suite. Eleanor, Dorian, Nadia, Ray. Ray had brought food without being asked, which was how Ray operated. He saw what was needed and did it without making a speech about doing it. They ate, they talked. Not about the board. Not about Conrad or the vote or the legal proceedings that Adrian had already set in motion. About other things. About Thomas Voss, who had been complicated. About Eli, who had not been complicated at all. About 8 years. About Newark. About life varies that opened early. Nadia laughed at the library part. The kind that surprised her on the way out. "You read everything you could reach," she said. "Everything," Dorian said. "That's from me." She shook her head slightly. "I read everything I could reach since I was 7. My mother said I'd go blind before 40. She paused. "I turned 61 in September. Eyes are fine." Dorian looked at her. This was a thing he had not had before. A sentence that connected a habit of his to a source. A reason for a part of himself that predated the hospital and the shelter and the 8 years of not knowing. He read everything he could reach, because his mother read everything she could reach, because her mother had worried about it. A chain. An actual human chain made of nothing dramatic, just people passing things forward without knowing what they were passing. After Ray left and Nadia had gone to the room Eleanor arranged for her, Dorian sat at the table alone for a few minutes. Eleanor came back and sat across from him. She set a folder between them. Inside, equity transfer documents. A block of Voss Capital shares registered in the name of Dorian Wess. He looked at the documents, then at Eleanor. "Thomas had a son who deserved to know his name," she said. Eli made sure there was a way back to that even when he was running out of time. Her voice stayed level. "The thing behind it was not level. I can't give you back 8 years, but I can give you this." He looked at the signature line. Dorian Wess. His name. Not the name the nurses had given him. Not the name a shelter put on paperwork. His actual name. The one his mother had chosen before he had any way to know it or claim it. He picked up the pen. He signed. The name sat on the page and looked back at him. Not borrowed. Not provisional. Not stamped on a file with the word resolved underneath it. His. A week later, Dorian went back to Madison Avenue. He didn't plan to. He was walking and his feet took him there and he let them. Corner of 54th North Side. The stone building where he pressed his back against the wall for 2 winters to cut the wind. He stood in the spot where he'd sat, looked at the sidewalk, at the morning foot traffic dividing around the space the way it always had, at the exact location where a paper cup had sat on the pavement on a Tuesday morning that felt like it belonged to a different version of his life. Which it did, because it had. The city moved, the city as he always moved. It had no memory for what happened on its sidewalks. It didn't mark the places, didn't hold them. The corner of Madison and 54th looked exactly the way it had looked every morning for 8 years. He reached into his inside jacket pocket, took out the pendant, held it in his palm. He looked at it for a moment, the wing shape. The red stone catching what little light the gray December forenoon offered. The slight weight of it in his hand that he had carried on his chest for 8 years without knowing why, and now knew exactly why. He thought about Eli Voss, 29 years old, running out of time. Still thinking ahead. Still building something for someone else past the point where most people stop building. He'd been right that Eleanor would recognize the necklace. He'd been right that it would hold. He'd been right about the bridge, about the chain that would lead eventually from a sidewalk on Madison Avenue back to a family and a name and a past that was real and a future that was open. He hadn't survived to see it, but he'd built it anyway, with what he had, in the time he had. That was worth something. Dorian closed his hand around the pendant, held it for a moment, then put it back in his inside pocket, close. Just not outside anymore. He didn't need it visible anymore to know what it meant. He didn't need it around his neck to know who he was. He knew who he was. He had a name on a document in Adrian's office. He had a mother in Newark with too much food and a photograph on her wall and a laugh that surprised her. He had Ray Tatum's number in a phone registered to his actual name. He had Wednesday with Adrian to discuss what inkex. He had a direction. He straightened. The foot traffic moved around him. The city ran its program, same as always, indifferent and enormous and continuous and entirely unbothered by what had happened to any individual moving through it. He stepped off the corner into the flow, into the foot traffic, into the morning. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him that he needed to carry, and ahead of him the city opened the way it always did, big and gray and running without him. The same city that had spent 8 winters not seeing him, the same streets, the same buildings, the same indifferent machinery. But Dorian West walked into it differently now, not because the city had changed, because he had. He had a name. He had a past that was real and a mother who was alive and a future that no one had the power to stamp resolved. He walked. The city moved around him, and this time, for the first time, he moved with it, and as someone it would have to reckon with. Not invisible, not anymore. Just a man who knew as exactly who he was and where he was going. And that was everything.